As Oscar mentioned, talking about CSS display properties versus HTML semantics. I will not be taking questions, which means when I am wrong, I will go unchallenged, which is kind of perfect. So let's dive into this. If I can make it go. It's like I've never done this before. There's a slide about me. We'll call that my ego slide. Just fly past that. So the thing about CSS display properties is they can override native semantics in the browser. Display properties specifically block inline, grid, flex, and contents can destroy everything that should be there that you might otherwise be relying on. Nothing in the HTML or CSS specifications actually mandates this. There's no reason that the browsers should remove it. They just do it. You can't add it back in either. If you add a display table or display table cell, doesn't matter. Nothing's going to happen. Browsers do not convey the correct semantics to the assistive technology. So that means any users who are relying on those semantics will be stranded. They might not be able to understand the content. They might not be able to understand or navigate the page overall. I like to use tables as sort of the canary in the coal mine because tables are this kind of swell, complex thing where if you get rid of or break any single required child element, the whole thing falls apart. You'll end up with missing rows or column headers or row headers. You won't be able to navigate. You get miscounts and everything. It's just a big problem. Conveniently, if you use the inspectors of assorted browsers and you take a look at the accessibility panel specifically, you can see when it shows up as a generic container instead of what it should be, which would be a table cell or a data grid, depending on the browser that you're using. Now, the accessibility tree that you will see in the browser is just a sort of a variation of the DOM. It's not a one-to-one correlation. It includes user interface objects from the browser and from the document, and it's created in the tree for every DOM element that has an accessibility event or property relationship or feature which needs to be exposed. And this is all abstracted for the developer tools so that you can just take a look to see what's going on in there without necessarily needing to fire up all sorts of assistive technology. So in the example I have here, I have a side-by-side of what a table would look like in the developer tools, in the accessibility panel specifically, where it says, hey, here's a table. And you add some display properties to it, and boom, it just says that it's ignored. Similarly, a caption is exposed properly. When you look at it after adding some display properties, it's there, but it's not associated with anything. It's just a caption for the region. Your THs, which should be column headers, just get ignored. Your cells or grid cells in the case of Chrome will also be ignored. Huge problem here because now all of those relationships are gone. Now, I spent some time putting together some testing charts because I wanted to go through and see what the actual support is in browsers today. When I first put this talk together for CSUN, everything was different, but not as different as you might think. So Chrome 86 actually does a really good job of still honoring tables, even when you've added flex, grid, block, inline block, or contents display properties. It falls down a bit with lists. Specifically, if you put display contents on a list, it's just not being registered as a list. Headings and buttons still work just fine. Now, Firefox 82, which was released today, which accounts for a little bit of how I spent some of my afternoon. Firefox 82 does some wonkiness here. Display flex and display grid on a table will essentially hide the table headers. The THs just go away. What that means now is your table no longer gives a screen reader user in particular any context for what any row or column is as they navigate into it. Tables are fine if they're display block, inline block, or contents. Lists are fine. Inline block and contents on lists just inserts a text leaf between each one, which has no effect on end users, at least none that I've discovered. Headings, fine. Buttons, if you put display contents on a button, you can't put focus on something that has display contents. So the developer tools will rightly warn you that this interactive element needs to be focusable, and it is not. It will still take a click event, but now you've completely stranded keyboard users. So they are stuck. macOS 10.15.6. I apologize. I don't track which mountain range that is. I still go by version numbers. So macOS 10.15.6 with Safari is a bit of a mess when it comes to tables. If you put flex or grid on a table, it will recognize the table in the caption, but the TR, the TH, and the TD has no idea that they're there, just sees them as plain text. If you put block, inline block, or if you put block or inline block on a table, you can navigate in VoiceOver with table commands, but the column and row headers aren't conveyed. They're ignored. It's as if they are not there. If you put display contents on a table, you can still navigate by row in VoiceOver, but you hear the entire row as a single string of text. So you'll know you're on row 6, but you won't understand how or why anything is coming across the way it is. Now with lists, if you put flex or grid on lists, what you're going to end up with is VoiceOver is going to break up any text that wraps. So if your list goes to 2 lines and you're using the virtual cursor, it's going to split it up. Not a big deal. Display block, inline block, and contents completely break lists. Headings are broken by display contents, and buttons are broken by display contents as well. Once again, you can click on a button. You just can't do anything with it. At least with a keyboard. Now, Chrome 86 on Android 11 basically performs as it does on the desktop. Handles tables fine. Lists, it handles fine until you throw display contents onto it. It will still mention that there are list items there sometimes, but it doesn't announce the list count, position, start, end, whether or not they're styled. It's worth noting that Chrome 86 on Android with TalkBack already does a poor job with lists anyway. It's just for some reason, when you exit a list that has display contents with TalkBack on Chrome 86, it tells you. I don't know why. That's weird. Headings are fine with all display properties, and buttons are fine with all display properties. They still continue to work. Again, the caveat being focus. Now, this slide is out of date by about 6 hours because iOS 14.1 was released today and claims to fix a number of VoiceOver issues. At a quick glance, looks like it doesn't address any of the ones that are here, though. Tables completely broken with display flex and grid. Block, inline block, and contents. All cells are treated as if they belong in column 1 when you're using VoiceOver. That's weird because they're clearly not in column 1. Lists are flex and grid, fine with lists. If you have lists with display block, inline block, or contents, it'll recognize the definition list, but none of the other lists. I find this interesting because it tells me that their recent fix to make definition lists finally recognized in iOS with VoiceOver somehow supersedes whatever is breaking it with the display properties. I would hope that they would extend that to work with regular lists. Headings with display contents broken, otherwise they're fine. And button with display contents will still fire on double tap with VoiceOver, but you as a user will not know that it's there. Now, display table is a little bit weird because as of Chrome version 80, if you add display table, table caption, table row, table cell, if you add those display properties, they add layout table semantics in Chrome. There's no CSS display property for column or row headers, so you can't do anything there. And this won't work if the structure is broken. It's important to note that this is not a workaround. It's not a fix, and definitely do not use this to try and turn your divs into tables. That's going to be kind of a jerk move because it will not work. When we look at it in Chrome's accessibility inspector, we can see that it's listed as a layout table with layout row table, layout cell table. These are not the roles that we expect to see, and they're not the ones we should count on. JAWS and narrator will read it as a table, but they will not announce any of the column or row headers. So there's a bit of a problem there. I said JAWS and narrator specifically. I thought I said NVDA. NVDA, VoiceOver, and TalkBack will not read it as a table. So to reiterate, don't rely on display table at all. So I have noted before that ARIA can come and help out on some things. There's this massive aversion from a lot of developers to using tables because of their previous misuse for layout. And ARIA can come and address some of this. It's just not the right way to do everything. Conveniently, there is generally a one-to-one mapping. The caption role is coming in ARIA 1.2, but you can use ARIA to reinsert lost semantics. You cannot address any content that's been reordered, and that won't address content that has been hidden through some other means. Generally, when it comes to trying to recreate a table in ARIA, don't use ARIA grid roles. I have strong opinions on that. I can point to a ton of research about that, but generally grid roles are not a fit for data tables. Grid is a complex widget. It is meant to be a single tab stop. It is not a data table. Whatever you do though, test with a screen reader. And it's important because, as I noted already, today, 2 new things were released that could have invalidated some of my testing. Turns out they really didn't, but when you have a release cycle of some browsers that's every N weeks, that means something you tested this month could be different next month. So you need to stay on top of this. If your tables are generated from script, you might need to update that script as well. So here, for example, is an example of a responsive table which reflows. It changes its layout on the page completely. Normally, that would break how it's rendered in the accessibility tree, but by adding a painful amount of ARIA roles, we can at least retain the semantics in the accessibility tree for screen reader users. Now, you might have heard of display contents. I'm seeing it kind of become the new hotness, so I'm calling it out specifically. When you use display contents, it essentially yanks the, it doesn't let the element generate any boxes. Children will still generate boxes, but the text is just treated basically as text. It's essentially treated like it's replaced by its own contents, kind of like yanking out the opening and closing tags. As a result, it gets pulled from the accessibility tree. You generally can't add anything with display contents back into the accessibility tree with ARIA. It just doesn't work. You could try, but it's generally not getting passed along. Again, continue to test this. Don't use it as a CSS reset, please. I've seen this happening. It's bad and it's hard to recover from. So you might be wondering, where is my beautiful table? You may ask yourself, where are my table semantics? You might ask yourself why it's broken. And we often wonder, how is this even a thing? I want to note first that this is not Assistive Technology's fault. Screen readers didn't mess this up. The accessibility information comes from the browser. The screen reader needs more than the DOM to understand the page, so it gets some of that from the accessibility tree. Years of misuse of tables meant that screen readers had to apply their own heuristics, and doing so meant that they had to deal with tables a little bit differently. I continue to use tables as my proxy because they have this long and painful history associated with them. Detecting assistive technology is not viable. There are a ton of reasons behind this, but generally users don't want us to be able to detect that. We also tend to make terrible assumptions, screen reader users in particular. Not all screen reader users are blind. And when we make that assumption, poor things happen. Trying to use mouse actions as a proxy for sighted screen reader users just doesn't work. And disabling the CSS for screen reader users is kind of a weird notion that I've had people float to me before. Don't do that. And then remember, on mobile, you have users who rely on touch gestures, and then we have to take into account mobility impairments. So don't try to detect assistive technology. CSS itself is not blameless here. It already impacts HTML semantics, and the simplest example of that is display none. It yanks things right out of the page. As I mentioned, display table does not impart table semantics. Flex and grid, by the way, make it really easy to mess up the source order or the reading order from the source order of the page, which means as soon as we start using it for layout, we run the risk of messing things up anyway. If you're using CSS grid to lay out an HTML table, it still won't be a table semantically, so you still have to account for it big reason why you might want to use a native HTML table anyway. ARIA, of course, is not ideal. If you're going to use ARIA correctly, you have to understand ARIA. You have to understand the structure you want. You need to have a clean DOM. You need to not break the first rule of ARIA, which says don't use ARIA. You'll also need to keep current on all the technologies you need to support. You have a bunch of stuff you have to manage, and it generally doesn't scale. If your CSS doesn't load, if any external resources don't load, you've got a problem. The techniques I've been talking through before are only a stopgap until the browsers stop breaking things. The browser itself isn't right. CSS specification does not state that the semantics should be dropped. There's no reason for them to do that. There's no reason for display properties to boot all that stuff out of the way. The accessibility tree at its core generally should not care about visuals, other than, of course, hiding things with the display none property. Now, I picked up my pace a little bit because I wanted to try to make up for some lost time here. So I'm wrapping this up now, but what I want you to do is I want you to consider paying attention to these two talks, primarily because I'm only touching on things at a very high level here. Sarah Higley is going to talk about finding root causes sometime over the next couple of days because I don't have the schedule handy. And some of what I'm talking about, looking through the accessibility and the accessibility panel inside the browsers, etc. Some of this is some of what she's talking about. There's a lot of great resources that she's going to talk about related to how you track stuff down and figure out where you're really breaking things. And then separately, Manuel Matuzovic is going to talk about writing CSS with accessibility in mind. He talks a little bit about some of the things I touched on, but he takes it even further. And it's more than just color contrast and text size, but he's going to look at all the ways that you can help and or hinder these things. So my recommendation is, if you haven't bought tickets yet, buy them, sign up, watch their two talks, and then come back and tell me everything that I got wrong, because that's why I'm here.